Hi everyone, welcome to Lessons Learned Leading an Open Source Diversity Team. I'm so excited to be here and see some of you in person, though it's hard to physically see you now. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're having this session on the traditional lands of the Skarure, the Siouan, and Lumbee peoples, and I want to pay my respect to their elders, both past and present. With that land acknowledgement, let's get started. My name is Fatima. I'm a developer evangelist at GitLab, where I work on community engagement and explore CI/CD. I have been contributing to the Drupal open source project since 2015 and have worked both in government and the private sector in web development and backend engineering, and more recently, developer relations. When I'm not working, I enjoy escape rooms, cooperative video games specifically, and reading books by the ocean. It's a great pastime. You should try it. You can find me all over the internet as Sugar Overflow. So a few years ago, I was working for a Drupal agency, and I was living in this cute little city called London, Ontario in Canada. And by day, I was doing Drupal development at this agency, and by night, I was doing the leadership of the Drupal Diversity and Initiative team. I like to say, the Sailor Moon song where it's like, doing work by daylight, doing DEI by moonlight. And as the leader, most of my free time was spent on conversations in the community, so preparing for events, providing strategy and advice for and with other community leaders, but also supporting moments of crisis, which happened quite often. And I think back to those days in that tiny little studio with a sofa that kind of felt like cardboard. And my dad would come to visit for a couple of months on end, and it was the first time in my life that we had done something that wasn't productive together, so I introduced him to this idea of binge watching Netflix, and we found this show we really liked. It was called The Blacklist, and we'd sit down after dinner and start watching this TV show, and then my phone would start popping off, 8 p.m. Pop, 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 Drupal Slack notifications, there's a crisis, people are arguing, I need to intervene. So I would pause this TV show, take out my laptop, and just start typing to people were bringing in their frustrations. Our channel acted like this mediator group where we were trying to support them in whatever crisis was happening in the community. And my dad and I would argue about it every night. He would be like, you're not getting paid for this work. This is off hours. This is your personal time. This is taking away from your life. And I was like, but this, Dad, it's important work. And I need to do it so that the next person that looks like me that comes into this community doesn't have to go through what I go through. So that's why I do this work. And we went through this holding pattern of arguments over and over again while I was the leader. And he was right. You have to find balance in the work. A year after some of those conversations, he passed away, and I didn't have the capacity to continue working with open source initiatives, with diversity work in the Drupal community. And I had to really step back and then step out and just take a break from contribution. So this talk has been 3 years in the making about things that I've been thinking about and reflecting on based on that leadership experience. So reflecting on that, one of the things that I think is important as a reminder is that this kind of work ties into people's identities, and it's very near and dear to their hearts. So when we talk about the ways that we did this work or the ways that we could do this work better, it can start challenging norms and things that people find deeply personal. So that's just an observation to keep in mind. So open source projects are not just about the code, they're also about how the code is created and managed and how the people that are contributing to those projects and the end users that are using those projects are treated. And so just as important as the code is who feels welcome to participate or who might not feel safe because of the tech that we're creating. It's this premise that led us to create the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. It was a volunteer group dedicated to making the community more inclusive. We provided resources, training, facilitation. We worked with other groups in the community in order to do that, presented at events, and did initiatives like mentoring new contributors or supporting speakers who are speaking for the first time. I was fortunate to lead it for about a little more than a year in one of the most divisive community crises that I had, so I feel like my experience was force and fire. So this talk is observations and lessons, but also just things I would have done had I known. And then at the core of talking about an open source diversity team is talking about community leadership, which can look different for everyone and come in different forms. So if I had to capture the most critical parts of leading the team, it would have started with building a community around that team. So you can't just show up and be expected to be heard. You kind of have to build rapport and talk to the other folks in the community and see what their needs are and create those spaces where people can engage, share their concerns, share their ideas. It's like making sure that the events in your community are accessible, or making sure that there's processes that make it easier for new contributors to get onboarded. Putting together activities, interactions that make people feel like they can belong. And then once you have a sense of that community, you have this group of passionate people, they've come together with the same goals and aspirations. Like, how do you make sure that they're on the same page? How do you support their aspirations and resolve the conflicts when they disagree on certain things? And then how do you help teams adapt to change? Sometimes there's something that happens in a community and you just don't know how to solve it. Sometimes a leader has to step away and suddenly you have this vacuum moment. People might have stuff going on in their lives that change the way that they can contribute. So how can you adapt to the change? Just a forward, I'm not really sure how we can adapt to change. So if you have thoughts on that, we should talk about it later. That's a work in progress. So open source projects naturally have these communities, but they don't organically grow diversity teams. I think that's work that needs to be really intentional. You can get together and decide, here's what we need in our community, and the way to start that is to better understand who the individuals are in your community. How do they participate? Are they maintainers, event organizers, conference attendees, speakers, volunteers? Are there community members who are paid by organizations to contribute? Are there community members who are doing it in their nights and weekends? What kinds of organizations are present? How willing are they to work and learn and sponsor? So when you have all of these details around the individuals and the community, you can start to figure out, okay, what are our goals as a team? So for example, if there aren't enough women speaking or non-binary folks speaking at your events, that's something that you can work towards, but you can't work towards it without knowing where your community is at. Another critical thing in assessing your community is identifying the power structures. And you'll hear me say this word a lot because I did want to keep this talk more applicable. So try to think about the organizations and groups that are in charge of your community. It really depends. And some of my coworkers and I are reading a book called Roads and Bridges, where I was learning that there's different models of open source governance. And I've come from a very centralized governance community with Drupal. But you might have different committees. You might have different associations that work together. So acknowledge those power structures, figure out where they're at as far as the work that you're trying to do. Do they need training or resources? Do they have the desire to pay an expert to come in and teach them about that? Is your team in a position of power where you can speak to them and collaborate with them? In some communities, you might even see like an us versus them mentality, where there's this breakdown of trust between the community at large and then the people that are in charge of that community. And then in that case, it takes a lot more patience and communication to start to repair some of that trust. So the way that I think about open source diversity teams and the things that they do is that they change the norms of their communities over time. Some of my mentors and I, we think about it like there's DEI teams on the ground in communities, and they start to do initiatives like, for example, bring pronoun stickers to the conference. And those pronoun stickers might start at the table, at the sticker table, at the table of the community initiative. They might even start in the hands of somebody who's working on that, handing them out. But eventually, the idea is that the overarching power structures absorb that work. And so, for example, when we started out bringing pronoun stickers, it's just an example, there's many things you can do, to DrupalCon, after a year, those stickers were now available at the badge pickup table. And so for me, it's important that the work that we're doing eventually becomes the norm, and then we can start to do the next level of important work, and then the next level of work. And so things that might be new and possibly contentious or things that people are uncomfortable with, I'd like them to just kind of get absorbed and become the norms. So this is the forming, storming, norming, performing Bruce Tuckman model of teams, and this helps people understand the growth of teams based on the different behaviors teams exhibit on stages of the process of the team. I like to extrapolate on this to visualize the different stages of an open source diversity team. So if we're thinking about like the work we do is getting absorbed into the overall community, we can look at this as like the different types of teams that you'll see in different open source community. So for example, when a team is forming on the Tuckman model, team members are really excited, they're really eager to have conversations, they have a lot of questions, a lot of anxiety as well, and you're not accomplishing a lot in the forming stage, but there's a lot of great energy and a lot of conversations. Similarly, when open source diversity teams first form, it might be like at an open space. It might be a one-on-one that you had with someone at a networking event. It might be like a birds of a feather boff. There's no formal processes, but there's a lot of conversations and a lot of, oh yes, we need that, and that's something we need to work towards. And so this is like the spreading awareness stage. In the next stage of the Tuckman model, teams start storming, so they realize like you can't live up to all of that early excitement and enthusiasm, and the reality on the ground is much different from what you were expecting. So team members might be frustrated, they might be expressing concerns, they might be angry about processes, they might want to change those processes. So what I see DEI stage teams that are at this stage, I see that they're kind of the most recognizable DEI advocacy models. It's like calling out, systems of oppression, speaking up when an event isn't accessible, calling people out on Twitter for not having enough speakers that are not white males on their speaking lineup. And it's more of what I call a brave space. It requires a lot of speaking truth to power. It requires a lot of like being on, being present, being like educating and influencing and explaining things to people that they may have heard for the first time. And so I think this is really effective for a short period of time in order to spread that awareness, but this isn't like a stage in which the team can live forever, because your volunteers will just keep burning out because they're being present and teaching and educating so often. The next stage in teams is when team members start to, work together. They feel safe to express opinions. In the Tuckman model, this talks about like individuals have now set their expectations a little more based on reality. They might feel increasing acceptance on the team. Similarly, DEI teams here will realize that they are starting to find middle ground with other groups, other committees in the community, other organizing groups, maybe even the power structures in the community. And I call this phase like bridge building. This is where your stickers can end up at the badge table, or your presentation is on the keynote stage, and suddenly your leader of your community is talking about DEI advocacy. And so I feel like initiatives get really watered down at this stage. So you might have the idea of what 100% perfect initiative looks like, but once you start collaborating with multiple groups in your community, the end result is more like 40 or 60% of what you originally wanted. But to me, that's also more sustainable progress towards that getting absorbed as a norm, because more people are working on it together and hopefully getting comfortable with it. And then the next stage of it, you can add a little bit more towards that. The next stage in the Tuckman model is performing. So this is like, where people are working together really well. They're sharing insights. They feel attached to this team. They feel like it's something greater than the sum of its parts. Similarly, in DEI teams, this is where you'll see sponsorships, like financial backing from organizations in your community. You might have like a scholarship program like we did to pay for people to be able to attend really expensive conferences and give talks, share strategies, hire people to do speaker training because experts know how to do it better than I do. And so this is like a really great place to be in as far as advocacy. And then stage 5 in the Tuckman model is kind of like where a group ends. And I haven't quite figured this out. This is a work in progress. But I think the breaks in open source diversity teams are more when someone leaves, or there's a really big crisis, or there's a change in the goals of the overall community. So when dynamics change, I think the team has to start forming and norming all over again. Another thing about community leadership is that people communicate really differently, especially with all of the text-based communication that happens in open source communities, and we lose a lot of context because of that. I have to remind myself to drink water. And so because these issues are so deeply personal to folks, it's really hard to communicate in a way that is constructive with your other team members, especially when something is really affecting you in a personal way. So some recommendations I have for improving text-based communications is try running your meetings on Slack or Discord or on a forum where they're async, they're accessible to everyone in any time zone, and they're documented. This is great because not everyone is primarily an English speaker, and not everyone is good at responding in real time, so some people might appreciate the time to go back, gather their thoughts, and step away, and then come back and share their perspective. So that gives them an opportunity to really reflect on what the topic topic is and to engage on equal footing with people like me who are just like, sure, you want me to do Pecha Kucha slides? I could do that right now. And then in the Drupal community, we conduct all of our initiative meetings on Slack. They happen at regularly scheduled times, and they happen threaded, so there's like topics of conversations with threads, and folks can jump in when they're available. At the end of the week, that thread gets exported to a Drupal.org issue where it's like documented, so people can also jump in there later if they weren't able to during the week. At GitLab, we also run a book club in a similar fashion. It's in a GitLab issue. We document our insights and our discussions, and then everyone can kind of add what they thought based on the reading. Another thing that's important is if you're seeing a pattern of miscommunications, like if you see the same two people on your committee or leadership team that aren't getting along, or they keep trying to storm quite often, I think it's really important to either address that yourself, bring them aside, or bring in an external facilitator. Maybe you have a code of conduct working group in your community. They can really help to bridge some of that understanding so that it doesn't build into resentment and doesn't make it hard for those individuals to continue to contribute to the effort. I also think that like, there's no real way to guarantee a safe space on leadership or committees. Like, you can try really hard, but at the end of the day, like, it is very difficult for everyone to feel safe. So you really have to continue to check in with your team, invest in them, do one-on-ones, understand like what are their hopes and dreams for this initiative, but also like what are their fears and concerns, and what are the things that would make them want to run away from this work. And having both of those things in your mind, you can better understand like when something happens, who are the team members that you need to support a little bit more versus the team members who are just gonna like run with the flag. And so that it's really important to get to know the people that you're working with. And then this phrase I learned from Code for Canada workshops is like, listen as much as you speak. I think this really only applies in real time or Zoom situations. It's like we've all been in situations where we're on this meeting or we're in this like working group and you just never get a chance to speak. And I think it's important to just have that as a self-reminder to be like, have I spoken a lot? Have I listened as equally as I have spoken? So I really like that phrase, and it stays with me. Another challenge that I personally ran into was team voice. So I had a group of individuals who are part of the founding team, and then a group of individuals who joined in the excitement when I started. And so I had like the jaded folks that were like, no matter what we do, this community will never change. And then I had the folks that were like, what do I do? What should I do? Should I work on this? Should I work on this? Should I work on this? And so balancing those two extremes was really difficult for me personally. And one of the things that we kept running into is, what is the team's voice? Do I speak for the team? Does every member of my team speak on behalf of the team? And one of the ways that we solved this was kind of prefacing the things that we said in meetings with, as the leader, or as a community member, this is my opinion. And that really helped kind of deal with some of the storming that was happening on my team in differing opinions. The other thing that's really important is who's accountable for being informed. So if you are having these async documented meetings, whose responsibility is it to make sure that they've been up to date, or make sure that they're reading those notes, or make sure that they're aware of what's going on? And ultimately, like, that depends on your team and how you choose to like dispense that information. Yeah. And then one other thing is the decision-making framework. You may not have this if your team is small, but as your team grows, you might have dissenting opinions. So figuring out how you're gonna make those decisions, who's gonna make them, and if it's like a consensus-based framework, what happens to the person that is on the other side of the consensus, and what opportunity do they have to share how they feel? When I first inherited the team, I met a lot of people at the event that it was announced at that just kept coming up to me and saying things like, I'm so glad you're the leader because you're nice. And I was like, what does that mean? Like, what kind of expectations do you have as me as a person and me as a leader? And it was like a really confusing place to be in, because the team had been in what we were talking about, like the storming stage, where they were calling out problems in the community. And I think a lot of people just looked at me and looked at my personality or how I looked and just had certain assumptions about how I would do that work. And so I didn't realize this until 3 years later, but set better expectations about what you're looking to do with your team, but as well as with your larger community. And you can do that by like having an expectation setting activity where you say like, here are all the things I expect from you in these initiative categories. What do you expect from me? You could do this like on Mural, like a whiteboarding tool. You could do this in person if you're fortunate enough to meet in person. And then when something big happens in your community, you want to like revisit those expectations to make sure that you're all on the same page. You also want to have like goals, like North Star. If you're relatively new, starting out in the community, it doesn't have to be like metrics based, doesn't have to be OKRs. It can just be like, we want to increase speaker diversity in our community, and then you have something to align all of your team members towards, or align the work that you're doing, so it doesn't feel like everyone's on fire everywhere. And it's like, well, we have a goal and we're working towards that. And that also makes people feel more valued because they can see their efforts kind of moving that goal forward. And then one important thing I learned is allowing people to decide how they want to be involved. Most of the time, people are volunteers. They're doing this in their free time. So ask people how they want to be involved based on their abilities and their time. So like check in on maybe they want to be advisors, maybe they want to be in day-to-day, maybe they're really excited to just be the project lead on an initiative. So it's good to check in on that, and then check in on that on a timely basis to make sure people still have the ability to give that commitment, so they don't feel like they can't stop or that they have to like sneak away and disappear and ghost you. And so if you check in openly, you're more likely to understand when people have to step away, and then you can have some kind of process to fill in when they need to leave. Part of that is also setting up roles and responsibilities. The open source guide has this really great resource page on leadership and governance about open source projects, and it gets a little bit more technical, like maintainers and code committers, but it does go into more depth about what's applicable to community teams. So as your team grows, you might want to have an advisory board. You might want to formalize how someone becomes a leader. You might want to have some kind of election system or an application form for joining your committee or leadership team. So if you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk more. This is somewhat of a work in progress. And then when I think about change, and like I mentioned, this is something I haven't quite figured out yet, so I'm open to a lot of discussions. But my personal experience being at the center of a diversity team is a lot like the ring theory of grief. So the ring theory is like in a crisis, we're at the center of a set of social rings, and when we face a crisis, the people closest to the ring can give are in the next ring, and then as the rings go out, it's more of the larger community, coworkers, people like that. And the person in the center ring can complain outwards and feel their grief outwards loudly, and comfort is supposed to flow in. As a leader or of a diversity team, I kind of felt like I was in the center of this crisis, but I wasn't allowed to complain outward, but all of the complaints were coming inward to me while I was also trying to figure out my role and what I wanted to do. And so, people weren't aware of that, and I was putting a lot of myself into the center of that ring. And so when the time came to step away, I just kind of like stepped all the way to the outer ring and reabsorbed into the community and didn't really talk about it. So that's one of my regrets. I wasn't open about how difficult it was. I felt like I was desperately trying to make the community better in the ways that I thought were good and the ways that my team thought were good, but we spent a lot of time fighting with each other, arguing, dissenting, and none of that was in the open. It was all in these back channels where nobody saw it. And I think it's already really, really hard to be a visible person of color in a position of leadership. You have your own imposter syndrome, and then you have like people thinking that you're not credible enough either. And so having had a few years to reflect on this and think about the systems that came about of it, I wish that we had been more transparent, that we had those discussions and differences of opinion and asked for help in more open forums and throughout the wider community. I'm sure there were people that could have helped us out. There were organizations that were willing to give us money to send people to conferences. They probably would have also been willing to give us support. So we achieved a lot of things, and we did a lot of great things together in collaboration with structures that existed in our community, and I'm proud of the work that we did, but I do wish that we were more transparent about what was happening on the team. And then a piece of advice that stays with me for many years from my mentor, Jeff Eaton, you matter more than the cause. There's no perfect formula to leadership, not when you're working on such important issues that are tied to identity and selves and safety and success. And so make sure that the places that you choose to invest your energy and your strengths and your passion and your voice are places that want you to be there. Make sure that they welcome people who look like you and look like me, and think about that before you choose to invest your time in there and know what you're getting into. Like, I still think back to those nights in my apartment with my dad after dinner, and although we bickered a lot about, you're not getting paid for this, or you're getting really emotional about this, like this side role is stressing you out in parts of your life, we also talked about a lot of things that I think I was never able to talk to him about before. Like, we talked about, privilege and being a woman in tech and his privilege as a white passing individual. And I don't think that we would have had those conversations had I not been involved with the work. And so there's two sides to everything. And so I am grateful for having the opportunity to have those conversations with my dad. And then that's all I've got for this session. Thank you so much for sharing your time and enthusiasm with me. There are still some things, like I said, that are work in progress that I'm still figuring out. So if you'd like to chat more, you can find me on the internet as Sugar Overflow, or find me on the conference. Thank you.